Hello learners, today we are going to talk about American poetry. So basically here we are going to talk about and discuss Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, the background, the historical and the literary background that basically that was basically around when Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson were living. So it's the 19th century. So the background basically comprised of many 19th century poets, and Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson were the most influential ones, and they were influenced by historical and literary events of their times. And if we say, Helen McNeil has said in her excellent study, which is named Emily Dickinson, she has said, as I quote, that if Walt Whitman is the American poet of wholeness, then Emily Dickinson is the American poet of what is broken and absent. And Walt Whitman is preoccupied with larger issues of liberty, equality and fraternity in mid-19th century America, in which the Civil War happened from 1861 to 65, and it posed a grave threat to the unity and cohesion of the nation. The Civil War ended in the victory of the northern states of the nation and defeat of the southern states. The passion aroused by the Civil War led to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the 18th century President of the Union. It is appropriate that when Lilac's Last in the Door Yard Bloomed, it is one of the most moving poems ever written by Whitman. It is a passionate elegy in which the poet has described the journey of Lincoln's coffin across the length and breadth of the nation. Walt Whitman is a poet of American democracy. And along with liberty and equality, it was fraternity, the ideal of human brotherhood, that emerges at the core of his poetry. Now, if we come to other American writers of this century, Emily Dickinson's literary works, as compared to them, differ from her English counterparts in being less about society and more about the individual's attempt to find their way in the physical or metaphysical environment. Dickinson's external life was restricted and secluded. She was kind of an introvert because of this. So she kept preoccupied with the plight of the individual, particularly a woman brought up in Puritanism dominated New England. Her poems are fragments that illumine the dark corners of a female who led a rather secluded life. And the 1,775 poems that are included in her definitive edition, edited by Thomas H. Johnson, only 7 were published in her lifetime. While Whitman died as the greatest poet of America, Emily Dickinson was nearly unknown at the time of her death. Let's talk about Walt Whitman's life and a few of his works. As he was born on May 31, 1819 in West Hills on Long Island, New York. He was the second son of Walter Whitman, a house builder, and Louisa Van Welser. In the 1820s and 30s, the family, which consisted of 9 children, lived in Long Island and Brooklyn, where Whitman attended the Brooklyn public schools. He was largely self-taught. He read voraciously, becoming acquainted with the works of Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and the Bible. Whitman worked as a printer in New York City until a devastating fire in the printing district demolished the industry. In 1836, at the mere age of 17, he began his career as teacher in the one-room schoolhouses of Long Island. He continued to teach until 1841. Then he turned to journalism as a full-time career. He founded a weekly newspaper, the Long Islander, and later edited a number of Brooklyn and New York papers, including the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. In 1848, Walt Whitman left the Brooklyn Daily Eagle to become editor of the New Orleans Crescent for 3 months. After witnessing the auctions of enslaved individuals in New Orleans, he returned to Brooklyn in the fall of 1848 and co-founded a free soil newspaper termed the Brooklyn Freeman, which he edited through the next fall. Whitman's attitudes about race have been described as unstable and inconsistent. He did not always side with the abolitionists, yet he celebrated human dignity. Refusing to toe the practical line adopted by the party establishment, he was sacked as the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle. This was Whitman's first encounter with party establishment, and he started to dislike party politics and began to take an independent, radical stand on the issue of slavery. In Brooklyn, he continued to develop the unique style of poetry that later so astonished Ralph Waldo Emerson. In 1855, Whitman took out a copyright on the first edition of Leaves of Grass, one of his most important works, which consisted of 12 untitled poems and a preface. He published the volume himself and sent a copy to Emerson in July of 1855. Whitman released a second edition of the book in 1856, containing 32 poems, a letter from Emerson praising the first edition, and a long open letter by Whitman in response. During his lifetime, Whitman continued to refine the volume, publishing several more editions of the book. Now coming to noted Whitman scholar M. J. Killingsworth, he writes that the merge as Whitman conceived it is the tendency of the individual self to overcome moral, psychological and political boundaries. Thematically and poetically, the notion dominates the three major poems of 1855. Number 1, I Sing the Body Electric. Number 2, The Sleepers. Number 3, Song of Myself, all of which were merged in the first edition under the single title Leaves of Grass, but were demarcated by clear breaks in the text. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Whitman vowed to live a purged and cleansed life. He worked as a freelance journalist and visited the wounded at New York City area hospitals. He then traveled to Washington, D.C. in December 1862 to care for his brother, who had been wounded in the war. Overcome by the suffering of the many wounded in Washington, Whitman decided to stay and work in the hospitals. He ended up staying in the city for 11 years. He took a job as a clerk for the Bureau of Indian Affairs within the Department of the Interior, which ended when the Secretary of the Interior, James Harlan, discovered that Whitman was the author of Leaves of Grass, which Harlan found offensive. After Harlan fired him, he went on to work in the Attorney General's office. In 1873, Whitman suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. A few months later, he traveled to Camden, New Jersey, to visit his dying mother at his brother's house. He ended up staying with his brother until the 1882 publication of Leaves of Grass, which was also accompanied in the publication process by James R. Osgood, which brought him enough money to buy a home in Camden. In the simple two-story clapboard house, Whitman spent his declining years working on additions and revisions to his deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass and preparing his final volume of poems and prose, Goodbye, My Fancy. After his death on March 26, 1892, Whitman was buried in a tomb he designed and had built on a lot in Harley Cemetery. Apart from his journalistic activity, he also read avidly the Ossian, Scott, and Greek and Hindu poets. His reading also reflected his intellectual curiosity and keenness to assimilate the best works both of Europe and Asia. This kind of an exploration of the Western classics and Eastern lore is also found in other members of the American Renaissance, like Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, and Mark Twain. Walt Whitman's prolonged stay in Brooklyn also gave him an idea of the sights, hurry, and bustle of the metropolis, that is New York, the commercial center of the New World. It was in the metropolis that Whitman became intimate with the drivers of omnibuses and ferryboat pilots, the crowds at the beaches, and the political orators charged with partisan politics. He also indulged in his passion for Shakespeare's plays and Italian opera. As a young man, he used to put on the airs of a dandy, but later on he began to look more rough and unpolished. It was in this frame of mind that he published Leaves of Grass in 1855. It consisted of 12 poems and a critical preface. And Song of Myself is a long, rambling poem that figures in the first edition of the Leaves of Grass. Many critics admired the originality and vigor of the anthology, but some critics were also disgusted with the explicit sex portrayal and denounced the work as an immoral book. Controversy apart, the work Leaves of Grass is an anthology that is the magnum opus of Walt Whitman's career as a poet. There is no wonder that the poet went on revising and enlarging it. Leaves of Grass is in free verse and is devoid of traditional rhyme and meter. Emerson greeted the publication of Leaves of Grass and lauded Whitman as the first authentic poet of the New World. Whitman published an enlarged second edition in 1856 and the third edition in 1860. It's strange that initially the poet was not affected by the Civil War that rocked the Republic, but it was wounding of his brother in the Civil War that roused his strong emotions. He went to Washington and became an unofficial nurse to Northern and Southern soldiers in the army hospitals. It was the agony and suffering of the soldiers that seared and corroded Whitman's soaring idealism and optimism. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated after the end of the Civil War, Whitman was thoroughly shaken and he wrote his most popular lyric, "O Captain, my Captain," and one of his major poems, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." The latter is an unforgettable elegy mourning the martyrdom of Abraham Lincoln. For a short time, Whitman worked as a clerk in the Indian Bureau of the Department of the Interior. But yes, as we know that he was dismissed by the secretary. In 1867 and 1871, Whitman issued the two new editions again. So he was there as a soaring vision of the entire globe, fusing the spiritual wisdom of the East with the materialism and technology of the West. Coming to his writing ways, after establishing his career, first as a journalist and then as a poet, he added more to the world of literature. Despite having challenges in life, he secured a noteworthy place in the list of great poets on account of his lucid style and thoughtful ideas. The demise of his parents and the cruelty of the Civil War provided him with an insight to feel the irreparable loss of life. Therefore, he elaborated on the ideas of loss, death, suffering in his poetry. The notable themes in most of his poems are love, freedom, beauty, man, and the natural world. Regarding literary devices, he often turns to visual imagery, similes, metaphors, and sound devices. Besides these devices, he successfully used the cataloging technique in his texts to display his great insight into the consciousness of human thought. Let's talk about a few works of his. To name a few, the best poems which of Walt Whitman could be. He was an outstanding poet, of course. Some of his best poems include Song of Myself, I Sing the Body Electric, A Noiseless Patient Spider, O Captain, My Captain, Calamus, and Song of the Open Road. Some other works of his are the notable works which were produced and include Franklin Evans, Drum Taps, Leaves of Grass, Specimen Days, Manly Health and Training, Democratic Vistas, and Life and Adventures of Jack Engel. Coming to Walt Whitman's impact on future literature. Walt Whitman was an iconic writer who started writing at his young age and became popular in his life on account of his diverse and self-conscious writing style. His unique way of expression and literary qualities have added enough into the world of literature. Also, he had a significant influence on a diverse range of writers and critics. One of the famous American critics, Benjamin de Caceres, lauded him as one of the true fathers of the futurists and cubists. His works are widely anthologized and taught in different curriculums across the world. In fact, he expresses his ideas in his poems so well that even today writers tend to imitate his style. Many consider him a role model for writing prose and poetry. Let's have a look at a few noteworthy lines. Number one from Leaves of Grass. Not I nor anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it by yourself. It is not far, it is within reach. Perhaps you have been on it since you were born and did not know. Perhaps it is everywhere on water and land. A few lines from Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself. And what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. 2 lines from I Sing the Body Electric. I say these are not the parts and poems of the body only, but of the soul. I say now, these are the soul. This is Walt Whitman's birthplace on Long Island, which is visited by a lot many tourists around the world. And this is a portrait of Walt Whitman, which was painted in 1889 by American artist John White Alexander. The Metropolitan Museum of Art gift, and it was a gift of Mrs. Jeremiah Milbank in 1891. Coming to another amazing poet, Emily Dickinson. Talking about her life and works, she was known for her eccentric personality and her frequent themes of death and mortality. Although she was a prolific writer, only a few of her poems were published during her lifetime. Despite being mostly unknown while she was alive, her poetry, which were nearly 1,800 poems altogether, has become a staple of the American literary canon, and scholars and readers alike have long held a fascination with her unusual life. Emily Dickinson was the daughter of Edward Dickinson, who was a prominent lawyer of Amherst, Massachusetts, and Emily Norcross. Since her mother became a bedridden invalid, Emily Dickinson confessed she had no mother. It was Edward Dickinson, her father, who was her strong and dominating father, who tended to be both father and mother to the child. He was such a stern and authoritarian father that he did not permit Emily Dickinson to study at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary for more than a year. The year was 1847 to 1848. Like Mrs. Malaprop in Sheridan's The Rivals, Edward Dickinson also believed that too much was not becoming for a young woman. It led to the growth of a female assertiveness and also caused a kind of discord and dissension in the family. Therefore, there is no wonder that Edward Dickinson also commanded his daughter not to go out of the homestead, which he had repurchased in the year 1855. As a young woman, Emily Dickinson asserted that she wouldn't go out of the homestead ever. She even refused to go to the church, which all women, old and young, were encouraged to visit. Choosing to live life internally within the confines of her home, Dickinson brought her life into sharp focus, for she also chose to live within the limitless expanses of her imagination, a choice she was keenly aware of and which she described in one of her poems this way: "I dwell in possibility." Her small circle of domestic life did not impinge upon her creative sensibilities. Like Henry David Thoreau, she simplified her life so that doing without was a means of being within. In a sense, she redefined the meaning of deprivation, because being denied something, whether it was faith, love, literary recognition, or some other desire, provided a sharper, more intense understanding than she would have experienced had she achieved what she wanted. "Heaven," she wrote, "is what I cannot reach." This line, along with many others, such as "water is taught by thirst," and "success is counted sweetest," or "by those who never succeed," suggest just how persistently she saw deprivation as a way of sensitizing herself to the value of what she was missing. For Dickinson, hopeful expectation was always more satisfying than achieving a golden moment. Writers contemporary to her had little or no effect upon the style of her writing. In her own work, she was original and innovative, but she did draw upon her knowledge of the Bible, classical myths, and Shakespeare for allusions and references in her poetry. She also used contemporary popular church hymns, transforming their standard rhythms into free-form hymn meters. Today, Emily Dickinson is regarded as one of America's greatest poets, but when she died at the age of 56, after devoting most of her life to writing poetry, her nearly 2,000 poems, only a dozen of which were published anonymously during her lifetime, were unknown except to a small numbers of friends and relatives. Dickinson was not recognized as a major poet until the 20th century, when modern readers ranked her as a major new voice whose literary innovations were unmatched by any other 19th century poet in the United States. Emily Dickinson neither completed many poems nor prepared them for publication. She wrote her drafts on scraps of paper, grocery lists, and the bags of recipes and used envelopes. Early editors of her poems took the liberty of making them more accessible to 19th century readers when several volumes of selected poems were published in the 1890s. The poems were made to appear like traditional 19th century verse by assigning them titles, rearranging their syntax, normalizing their grammar, and regularizing their capitalizations. Instead of dashes, editors used standard punctuation. Instead of the highly elliptical telegraphic lines so characteristic of her poems, editors added articles, conjunctions, and prepositions to make them more readable and in line with conventional expectations. In addition, the poems were made more predictable by organizing them into categories such as friends, love, nature, and death. Not until 1955, when Thomas Johnson published Dickinson's complete works in a form that attempted to be true to her manuscript versions, did readers have an opportunity to see the full range of her style and themes. Emily Dickinson found irony, ambiguity, and paradox lurking in the simplest and commonest experiences. The materials and subject matter of her poetry are quite conventional. Her poems are filled with robins, bees, winter light, household items, and domestic duties. These materials represent the range of what she experienced in and around her father's house. She used them because they constituted so much of her life, and more importantly, because she found meanings latent in them. Though her world was simple, it was also complex in its beauties and its terrors. Her lyric poems captures impressions of particular moments, scenes, or moods, and she characteristically focuses upon topics such as nature, love, and faith and doubt, and the pain but the self. Though her materials were conventional, her treatment of them was innovative because she was willing to break whatever poetic conventions stood in the way of the intensity of her thoughts and images. Her conciseness, brevity, and wit are tightly packed. Typically, she offers her observations via one or two images that reveal her thought in a powerful manner. She once characterized her literary art by writing, "My business is circumference." Her method is to reveal the inadequacy of declarative statements by evoking qualifications and questions with images that complicate firm assertions and affirmations. In one of her poems, she describes her strategies this way: "Tell all the truths, but tell its slant. Success in circuit lies." This might well stand as a working definition of Dickinson's aesthetics. Emily Dickinson's poetry is challenging because it is radical and original in its rejection of most traditional 19th century themes and techniques. Her poems require active engagement from the reader because she seems to leave out so much with her elliptical style and remarkable contracting methods. But these apparent gaps are filled with meaning if we are sensitive to her use of devices such as personification, allusion, symbolism, and startling syntax and grammar. Since her use is sometimes puzzling, it helps to read her poems aloud to hear how carefully the words are arranged. What might seem intimidating on a silent page can surprise the reader with meaning when heard. It's also worth keeping in mind that Emily Dickinson was not always consistent in her views, and they can change from poems to poem, depending upon how she felt at a given moment. Dickinson was less interested in absolute answers to questions than she was in examining and exploring their circumference. We shall continue the part 2.